Welcome to the shop, everyone. In this video, I'm going to take you start to finish through my process of making these two picture frames. So let's get started. So I've just picked out my boards. I'm going with cherry for these frames, and it does pain me to break down this really wide material, but I know it's really beautiful stuff and it'd be perfect for these picture frames. So I start by doing a rough layout to figure out how I want to break down this material. And typically with picture frames, I want to use a board that's long enough to yield all four sides of the frame so that you get a continuous grain look around the entire frame. So I do not have a board that's long enough. I have a board that will yield me three sides and then this shorter one that I can get the last side from. But it's cut from the same material, so it's going to match in really well. My frames are 2 1/4 inches wide, and here I mark out for 5 inches. And that should give me enough material for both frames. And this longer board is a little bowed, so I'm going to use the track saw and cut a straight line. And the track saw is probably one of my most used tools in the shop. It's kind of my go-to for ripping a straight line. And from there, I've got a great straight edge reference surface to move on to the next step. In this case, it's going to be the bandsaw. So now I can set up the fence on the bandsaw and make a nice clean cut. I like to use the radial arm saw to break down rough material. It feels a little safer to me than the miter saw. Also, I've got the dust collection set up really well. So at this point in the process, I'm kind of bouncing around between machines. Here I'm coming to the table saw, and I'm going to rip these boards in half. Now this is not a rip to final width, but I'd like to get the boards a little closer to their final width in preparation for the jointer. My jointer is wide enough and it would have accommodated those boards had I not ripped them in half, but I feel like I have a little more control this way and I get really good results. This milling process is similar to how I would make frame and panel doors. So the jointer makes one flat face, and then I use that face against the fence as a reference to make one edge 90 degrees to that face. And I use a pencil to mark the sides I've jointed, just to keep track of everything. And this is some really beautiful cherry. So at the planer, I make the opposite face flat and parallel. And I'm really not aiming for a particular dimension here. I just really want both sides to be nice and flat, and whatever thickness that ends up being, that'll be what I go with. back at the table saw yet again, but this time I am cutting to the final width. Here I'm making the first cut on what will be the rabbet. Now the rabbet is in the back of the picture frames and it holds the glass or plexiglass and some sort of backer. Oh, of course the picture too. So now I adjust the blade height and finish the cut. And the result, nice and clean. Oh, hey there, bud. Drills are awesome. But not as awesome as this camera, right? Well, where to next? The workbench? Yep. Nothing like a good vise. All right, back to work. To cut the miters, I use this shop-made miter sled. I'll leave a link in the description to a video that I watched that helped me learn how to make this. So I make a first cut, and then measure and mark the length. In this case, it's 14 inches. Now I'll put that mark directly on the saw curve. And then I make a little mark on the sled itself. And this will be a reference for the next piece that is cut at this length. You may be thinking that this is probably pretty inaccurate. And you may be right, but I take it very slow, and I'm very careful, and I get really good results. And I just haven't thought up a better way yet. But I do like the way that came together. I decided to add a chamfer on the inside edge of the picture frames. I think they were looking a little bulky, and I just thought a chamfer would lighten them up a little bit. I recently upgraded my router table, and I've really been enjoying the cast iron top. And this router lift is really easy to use. It really just made a huge difference in workflow. So with the new bit installed, I used the straight edge on my adjustable square to line up the bearing with the fence. And with that nice and flush, I can tighten it down. Looks good. And now for the rest of them. Now back at the workbench, time to get these things glued up. Oh yeah. So for this glue up, I'm using these adjustable corner clamps. They work really well on mitered picture frames. With everything lined up how I want it, I will pull off each piece individually and apply glue. And something I found that has helped me with these glue ups is I'll push the joint together with my hands and apply just enough pressure for a little bit of glue to squeeze out. I'll hold it there for a little bit, a couple seconds, and the glue tacks up so fast that it actually holds together really well and doesn't slip at all when I tighten down the clamp. So while the glue dries on these frames, I'm going to pick out some material for the splines that I'll add to reinforce those joints. And I've got some walnut here. This piece in particular is nice and thin, and it's going to work really well. The drum sander works really well to clean up this thin material and also sand it down to its final thickness. So after a few passes, it's ready to go. But I'm going to go ahead and let that glue dry a little longer. Back in the shop, I'm going to undo these clamps. Everything looks good. I'm going to bring them to the drum sander and just do a few passes on either side to get everything really nice and flat. So now I'm going to get ready to cut the slots in the picture frames that will accept the splines. So I switch out my combination blade for a square tooth blade or flat top grind. Here it is. And these blades are perfect for this application because the saw kerf is nice and square. And that's important in this case because these cuts are visible. And you'll see what I mean in a minute. Another useful jig to have in the shop when making picture frames is the spline cutting jig. And I'll leave a link in the description to a video that I think is really helpful in making this. So I set the blade height. And then start cutting. Each cut is made referencing both sides of the frame, and this leaves you with a centered slot. I place the spline material into one of the slots and scribe out 4 splines, making sure to not scribe too tight, as I want the splines to sit slightly proud. I use the bandsaw to cut out 4 splines. And then I set up the fence, and I can get 4 more. Now some wood glue. And set them into place. And the main reason for adding these splines is that they add an incredible amount of strength to this otherwise weak joint. And a nicely fitted spline shouldn't require any clamping. So we'll let that dry. I'm fortunate to have this edge sander, and it really makes quick work of flushing up these splines. But of course, no project is complete without a little hand sanding. So I get both frames sanded to 180. Vacuum off excess dust. The majority of time I'll use mineral spirits as well to remove further dust, but this time I didn't. So I'm using Tried and True, and I just wipe it on with a shop cloth. After I get everything fully covered, I let it sit for about an hour to soak in, and then I come back and wipe off the excess oil. And repeat that process a couple times. Here I'm cutting my backing material. This is 1/4 inch MDF. I'm using plexiglas as opposed to real glass. I like being able to cut it at the table saw. For whatever reason, it wanted to lift as I was feeding it through the saw. Maybe I'm using the wrong blade. So now it's time for hardware. This is just a simple toothed hanger. And to hold the backing in place, I'm using these little figure 8 shaped tabs. They're really easy to install and seem to work well. Now for the plexiglass. Remove the film, drop it into place, add the picture, the backer board, flip the tabs in, and it's done. Well, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the process of making these simple but beautiful picture frames. And I hope you also learned something that maybe you can apply to your next woodworking project. So thank you so much, guys. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel. I'd really appreciate it. See you next time. And no, those are not picture frame models. Those are just my beautiful relatives.